So, welcome to the latest in our series of CIPR Sport Group conversations. Every month, we've been talking to a different special guest, asking them to offer some stimulus for those working in sport comms, some insights for those who might want to come into this world, and some great advice for anyone across communications. I'm Chris Haynes, and I'm here with Scott Dougal, both from the CIPR Sports Group. And today's guest is Dan Maisey, who can give us some great insights into building a career in sport, understanding recruitment into sport, and how to navigate this world, whether it's for yourself or for building your own team. Dan has spent 13 years in the sports industry in a range of roles, transitioning from early years in management consultancy. His career in sport has included performance roles with Chelsea, the RFU, and Loughborough, and he's worked at CSM and Harlequins in commercial roles before venturing into startup world with a sports-focused social media agency. A self-prescribed generalist, Dan then set up his own recruitment company, aiming to change the way the sports industry finds and supports great people and allowing talent coming in from other industries too to thrive. Just a month ago, he decided to step away from this all, embarking on a new career in sports injury rehab performance. A big step, bravely, boldly presented on LinkedIn. So who better and when better for some insights into the shape of the sports industry, opportunities now and in the future, and how recruitment really works at all levels in sport. Dan, welcome.
Thanks, Chris. It's quite the introduction. Quite a lot to live up to there.
Well, I mean, we've talked a bit over the last few weeks, and I just think it's a time you have a very, very interesting take for all of us on an industry that's already always changing. But can you tell us first, how would you describe your career and the shape and the trajectory of your career?
That's a really good question. You said it in the intro, and I think the word generalist, it gets a bit of a bad rap, but actually kind of the more I reflected on the last how many years and as I was going through my career, actually, you kind of see a lot of the generalists that are coming through and the reason why they've done that. So my career path has taken me effectively into where the opportunity lie and where the interest for me was. So I knew when I left university, having done a performance-based degree, having done the experience that you outlined there from a performance perspective, at the time I didn't want to go into performance. I'd fallen out of love with it. Fundamentally, I wanted to still be a player rather than the coaching side, and I knew that I needed to get business experience, and so management consultancy gave me an opportunity to hit a grad scheme and get the experience that I needed from a business perspective. I think I always had in the back of my mind that going back into sport in some kind of way or another. It took me a very long time to transition from management consultancy into sport. I think it probably took me 18 months from the decision to try and leave to actually finding a new role. And a lot of that is still the challenges we see today in terms of lack of experience. But equally, and being completely open and candid here, I was going from a grad scheme that was 35 grand a year to jobs that were on for 16, 17, 18 grand a year, which I couldn't afford to do living in London. My family aren't from around London. So it was a challenge to find somewhere that could pay. And even that first job, which was in a company called what was PMP Legacy at the time, which formed what kind of part of CSM, or what CSM became, that was still quite a chunky pay drop for that, and I had to negotiate that pretty hard. And the only real reason that was an opportunity was because my boss was ex-Accenture as well, and we were in that post 2012. Lots of people that were still working in the sports industry, but lots of people that had come from other industries because 2012 was such an opportunity for lots of people. So you had that opportunity there, but fundamentally, going back to the original question, I've just taken where those opportunities lie. Even in the years that I was at CSM, I didn't have one job role. I wasn't an account exec going up to an account manager, going up to account director, etc. I took the opportunity, whether it was going into more business development side of things, working on the commercial strategy side of things, working with broadcast side of bits and pieces, and doing what was interesting. And then when the Quins opportunity came up to go and head their partnership management side of stuff, that was an opportunity that I didn't want to pass out because it was my local rugby club. It was a real opportunity to go in and do something a little bit different. And I think again that was what was interesting for me is that, and it's similar with the bits that have come after that. My career path hasn't. I was reflecting on this a little bit overnight. And I think at the time, in my head, it was I want to become a chief commercial officer and then become a CEO of a football club or rugby club or a sports club. I think in hindsight now, being so specific was a mistake because it narrowed my gaze, even though I've done a lot of other kind of elements to the last 5 years, really. So having that career path and that kind of objective was great, but I think actually in reality, I just took the opportunity where I thought was interesting, going into social media, going into my own thing. It was actually I think I can do this. It's an interesting piece of the puzzle now, and how do I put those pieces together to get me to the more rounded
Yeah.
business person ultimately at the end of the day.
It's interesting how you talk about a career where you take opportunity, and it started with a grounding in consultancy. And I talk to a number of young people where I think, particularly when you work in communications, and it's hard for people to see your ology, that if you start from a world of consulting, people understand the rigor of your thinking, the strategic thinking, and it's always on the CV to build on. So it's interesting you took that brave transition from something where you say you're earning a certain amount to step down and across to follow a passion. If I then said, you've come to another point of transition, and I won't quote the whole thing, but I'd urge anyone to read it. But when you put a very personal positioning on LinkedIn and you said, I'm calling it a day on the sports industry as a whole, and try to push change in a world that desperately needs to change to prepare itself for the future. I've met some brilliant people in what is a fantastic industry to work in. It's just not an industry for me anymore. Can you tell us more about that decision and this transition?
Yeah, there's a lot of elements to it. The company that I was working with at the time, Greenings, having transitioned from my own thing into them. No, a really good opportunity. I still believe in the proposition that was there, but ultimately, in order to really put my whole self into it, it would have involved a lot of travel, and it wasn't right for my family. My wife's just got a new job, and that gave me an opportunity, and I'm in a very lucky position in that sense that I am able to make the decision, be able to spend a bit more time with my children, and also try and build something in a slightly a bit more of a specific passion of mine from a kind of industry perspective or field, I would say. But ultimately, the decision came down to the last 3 years been incredibly difficult. There have been some real low points. There's been some really high points, as is always the case. And that post, and for anyone that followed me on LinkedIn, firstly, apologise for the amount of stuff I put out. But I was always, when I set out on the journey to do something myself, I always said I would be as honest as I possibly could to everybody, because I think the challenge we have at the moment, and this is a wider culture piece, but you see everyone's Instagram, you see everyone on TikTok or whatever it might be, and it's life is amazing. You're a unicorn founder after 6 months work. You've got a 4-hour work week with Tim Ferriss. All of these things are great, but they're so unlikely. And actually, what you miss is all of those low points. And there are some really, really good entrepreneurs that really kind of are very honest. Dan Maisey is a good example of it. He's founder of a company called Heights, which is a supplement company, which is going great guns at the moment. He's very honest. He also does a really good newsletter for people that want to start companies and stuff like that. But I think throughout that period, kind of say 2.5, 3 years that I was doing this by myself, it's lonely. You go into an office, you're with your friends, or you're with people that you get to talk to people. You're not that as a founder, as a solo founder, and Greening enabled me to have a bit more of that interaction, but ultimately it just got to a point where if I was going to carry on with Greenings, it would have meant a step up with, like I say, the travel, with the commitment that I wasn't necessarily prepared to do in an industry that I had, again, coming back to the point around I made 15 years ago, I'd fallen out of love with because of the frustrations that I've had over the last 3 years, and the amount of conversations that I've had with very, very senior people in the industry that agree with my way of thinking and agree with what I'm trying to do, but when it comes down to it, we'll go, well, we can't do it that way anyway. And equally, the same amount of conversations with again the kind of people that at the very top of their game that are thinking, I don't want to be in the sports industry anymore because I can't deal with this anymore. I can't deal with governance is one of the biggest issues, but and that's just there was just kind of everything came to a head. I had an opportunity. My wife and I sat down over a long period, discussed it. We went away, an opportunity to go away with the kids for a while, and kind of came back, and that was the clarity, right? I will support her to do as best as she possibly can in this role whilst looking after the kids. But equally, I've got an opportunity here to go back into education, to retrain, and to be as best as I possibly can be, but just in a slightly different field. It's still within sport, effectively, and I'm not burning bridges or anything like that. And I can still help out, and I still do help out where I can. But ultimately, I'm not waking up every morning thinking, "Gosh, I don't want to do this anymore." I'm not having the same conversation every single time.
Uh, That's I think that experience of everyone recognizing the need to change, Dan, but no one actually being willing to then take the step of embracing that change, I think is very familiar. What is it, do you think, that needs, I mean, without giving us a full shopping list, what is it you think you would like to see needs to change, and what do you think is stopping that?
How long have you got, Scott? I think. No, I'm joking. There are some very, very good people in the sports industry, some really high level operators, but equally, there's a lot of mediocrity at senior level, and there's two, for me the two biggest things were certainly from a recruitment perspective. Well, I suppose they both relate to recruitment, but the first thing was that yes, you kind of agree with you, but I can't afford to use a service that I know will get me the best people in. And I think there is a little bit of a reticence in comparison to other industries that accept not necessarily just recruitment, but the process around strong, good recruitment. I think there's less of an acceptance to do that, and I think twofold. One of them obviously comes down to money. Fundamentally, sport is certainly sports clubs are loss making in the majority of cases, and so it's an easy way of saving money. Go through a what is normally a pretty overstretched human resources department, and this is nothing against any of those because they end up having to do about 15 people's jobs with two of them. But equally, those when I left the social media agency and I was looking for a new job before I kind of decided to start up through my own frustrations. But if I didn't have that exact linear experience, then there was no chance of me doing that. So, but I've done that, but I've also done this, which can offer a lot more to that final role. But it doesn't matter. You don't have 10-figure deals on your deal sheet. You don't have 15 years of experience of managing a particular partner. And it's like, well, what you're doing there is creating a very, very small pool of people that can be good for that job. Whereas actually, if you look outside the sports industry, even if you look at partnership management as a perfect example, you go in the sports industry and you spend 10 years looking after various different partners, whether it's football, F1, whoever it might be. That's great, but you've got one very specific piece of experience there that is partnership management, and you've got all the different bits and pieces that add onto it, but that's it. Whereas if you look outside the sports industry and you look at partnership management from a tech perspective or from a finance perspective, actually what you can do is bring in experience and knowledge there that the nuance of sport in the majority of times is pretty easy to learn. But if you've got the other experience that they can add in, then that is invaluable. And I always, and one of the kind of reasons of not the reason I set it up, but one of the reasons behind focusing in on trying to bring new talent into sport was when I was at Harlequins, the best salesperson I've ever worked with across all of my years was at Harlequins. He was a software sales guy by trade. He'd been brought in by our commercial director, and he brought more partnerships in the 18 months or so that he was there than they had done in the previous 4 years, give or take. And that was because he had the training and the process and the knowledge. We gave him the contacts and the sports nuance. It helped that he was a Quins fan, and he knew rugby. But ultimately, the business side of that. But he knew what to do, and he knew that, and he trained the person up that was working in his team, and he's now gone to be an excellent salesperson as well. And it's, that's the difference, I think, in certainly different industries. I don't think we have a particularly good way of training people, for one, from the bottom up. And I think the biggest thing for me is ultimately looking outside the box for that talent. And some places will do it more than others, but equally you get down to that last two, and if you've kind of got someone that's a bit of an outlier and someone that has exactly the right experience, the majority of the time, purely from a risk management perspective, and especially at the moment where it is a very risk averse environment and has been for the last 3 or 4 years now, you're going with that person that at least over the first 6 months will be able to do the job properly.
Yeah.
Whereas the person that didn't get that job might have had a bit more time to get used to it, but 6 months to 3 to 5 years plus would have been 10 times more successful,
And
as a general rule.
Is that very different from, it's a longer question coming, but is that very different from other industries?
Probably not. But I think the difference is in certainly other industries, and I can only speak from personal or close personal experience, the amount of interviews that I know people have been through and psychometric testing and really understanding who the person is and how they work in order to get, everyone talks about getting the A player in. But the only way you can do that is by having a very structured, very specific, and very proper process to find that person. And it means not only being able to do the job, but actually being able to do what they want that job to be in 6 to 12 to 18 to 24 to 36 months' time and beyond. Because I think a lot of the times we get a bit caught up in someone's left, we've got to find the job, we've got to find their replacement immediately. Actually, there are ways and means that we can do that in terms of part-time or contracted staff to fill a gap, which some agencies do a bit better than others. Bring a new client on board, and then you fill that client team with contractors until you find the right people to come in to do that full time. But that's still very rare. You tend to just be a bit rushed, and I think there are a lot more. Certainly from a finance and a law perspective, the two that I know probably better than others, they have the pipelines. They know who they're going to be talking to in 6 to 12 months' time when those jobs potentially come up. And because they've had that plan and they're looking at that 3 to 5 year plan, they know, right, we can identify these people now. So when we know that we're 6 months out from that hiring process happening, we take into account any kind of potential notice period, any type of interview period. Right, we need to speak to them now for a job that's going to come up in 6 months' time, because they've already got that pipeline in. And there are some recruiters and some recruitment agencies that are starting to do that in the sports world, and I think that's great, but it doesn't happen very often. And so I think it's just a case of trying to avoid that speed of hire. We have to hire now because we've got this person, we've got this client starting next week and we haven't got a team for them, or whatever that might be. And I think that's the biggest real challenge, I think.
It's Scott and I talked about this with previous guests as well, about sort of 20 years ago, no one talked about there being a sports industry. And the opening up of platforms and content and the rights market has created this self-proclaimed industry. And it's interesting because on the one hand, let's say in high performance, an area well, there's a lot of magpie thinking of bringing great ideas from other places and applying them. But at the same time, someone I won't name said with his client base in sport compared to broadening into other worlds, he said sport can be very needy and doesn't like to pay. It was very much harder. I wonder if you had any thoughts about that difference. I mean, I found recruitment processes different going into other worlds than it has been within sport.
Yeah, I think the pay thing is, it's one of my biggest frustrations more generally. I think you take a step back and you look at how much the sports industry is paying for talent more generally. And again, that's starting to change at the top level, mainly due to the Americanization of sport, realizing that you need to pay top dollar to get the top people in. But it flows down, and look, I'm fully aware of the kind of economic elements to this. But if you've got a school leaver or a grad, not that I think you need to be a graduate to work in the sports industry, but that's a different topic. And they have an opportunity to go into an apprenticeship, to go into sport, to go into finance, or to go into management consultancy. You have on that list, apprenticeships slightly different because it's educational element to it, so we'll take that to one side for the time being. Management consultancy generally 30 to 45, 50k starting salary, depending on where you go. Finance, depending again on the role, 50 to 75 to 80 to plus sometimes. Sport is still down at that 18 to 22 to live in London. And unless you have the means by which you can live in London on that type of wage, you cannot afford to do that. Or you are one of those people that are so adamant, and again, I've met those people that are so adamant that that's where they want to work, that they're going to do anything they can do to work in it. And that type of person is likely to be the outlier when you get to the end stage of that senior management side of things, that know the struggle and that understand to get the right people that you actually need to pay because they've been at the bottom in that instance. The challenge, I think, and this comes by the mediocrity piece I mentioned earlier, is that you have a lot of people that could afford to do that 15 to 20 to 25 years ago that are now at that senior management level, that are now just looking for the same people, the same universities, dare I say it, the same schools that are coming in. And I saw that in my career, and I won't go into detail, but you could see it. And you look at the type of person, you go, well, sport as an industry, if you kind of take it back to what point you mentioned about it being a fairly new industry, it is a fairly new industry. It's a fairly new business. Sport's been around for ages, but the money behind it is relatively new. And you could probably thank Rupert Murdoch for a lot of that. But I think what we have is you've got this sort of like, well, everyone wants to work in sport, and therefore we don't have to pay you as much. And actually, you're kind of starting to get a little bit of that within social media and agency world as well, because everyone wants to be a content creator. So it means we don't have to pay you that much to be a content creator, because you do what you love and you don't get paid as much. And I just think you turn people off from that way of thinking if you think that way. And that for me, I think you kind of look at, then coming back to your point around when you're looking at paying for services, that attitude is still there. You want to work for a cool sports agency. Well, we're not going to pay you as much as you would for your normal clients. Why would we do that? And you get the right agencies, and again, I won't name them, but there's some good certainly comms, advertising, PR agencies that will just go, well, I'm not going to work for you. These are my terms, and if you don't want it, then we won't work for you, because this is the work that I do, and I need to be paid for that work. And some places will go, well, fine, we'll go to a cheaper place, and invariably the content is slightly different, let's be polite. But I think it's, I kind of said this to others, but I think for me, there's an underlying egoism to sport that is, if you work in sport, then you're within the family, and therefore the opportunities are there. If you don't work in sport, it's really fucking difficult to get into it, because, and we can go into this, but because you're not part of the family, everyone wants to work in sport. So unless you want to work for nothing, then why would we take you? And then if you take a step out of sport, which I did with the social media agency to a point, trying to get back into it is not impossible as well, because you've been out of it. You've kind of gone, well, where's the last 2 years has gone? Why haven't you not done that linear experience? And again, there are obviously, this is a very generalist point. But I think one of the things, just before I left Greenings I went for lunch with for coffee with and I won't mention him, but a very, let's call him a sports dignitary. And he'd been out of sport for the kind of 10, 15 years. Sorry, 10, 12 years since he sold his last company. We've been doing bits and pieces outside of sport. But his sport federation invited him back into the fold. Like, come back in, see everybody, come to the events. And he said he went to the event and it was amazing because all of my old friends were there. It was like nothing had changed and it was brilliant. But that's also the problem. Nothing had changed. All my old friends were there, and I'm, he's mid-80s, and again, you get the people in the business, and actually, that's probably slightly harsh on that sport because they're doing a lot of good stuff, but you have that level of people that just do not want things to change, and fundamentally, the only things that are changing that as we speak at the moment are new formats, which is basically being pushed forward by institutional money, whether that's sovereign wealth or whether that's private equity. And we could kind of, I'm not going to get into the pros and cons of the private equity side of things because it's not my knowledge base, and sure, someone like Roger Mitchell would shoot me for it. But I think like that's ultimately what is going to drive this change, is smarter people coming in at the very, very top from a money perspective.
And you've twice, I think at least twice, Dan, mentioned the word generalist, and I've got a feeling that you will have read David Epstein's book, Range, perhaps, but I think for and good communications professionals should be generalists. And just think about, hires that I've made, I would say, my top 2 or 3 I've done in my career, 2 of them probably came from outside of sport, from a different sector, because they brought something fresh. And you do worry when you're doing that because it is a risk, because you're the hirer, and you bring this person and they sink without trace, and it's on you really. But when it works, it's terrific. But and the other thing that the other ism I would say is exceptionalism. Sports exceptionalism, we're different, and I think even within sport there is exceptionalism. So football believes itself to be exceptional. If you're a communications professional, either coming into the sector at the bottom end or looking to move across, how do you navigate that? I suppose what is the way through that? And I think part of that is getting a good deal for yourself, because I think the other thing you spoke about, which really resonated, was sport thinks it can get away without rewarding people or giving them development opportunities because it's sport, and it's a cool thing to do. That was a long question, but yeah, I suppose it's how are young professionals coming into communications at the bottom end or moving across? How are they going to do that in the right way for them? What's your view?
Yes, it's a really good question, Scott. I think, and this isn't necessarily specific to comms, but ultimately, love it or loathe it, sports network based, as I'm sure but there's a lot of industries that are, but I think the more you can ingratiate yourself into that type of network, and there are things, Andy Marston, who runs Sports Pundit Group, as an example, there's another one run by a few guys called Sports Business Syndicate as well. Those types of things that are ultimately free to join, and that's the key. To just understand and start getting a bit more knowledge around who are the players in this market, and who are the people that I need to speak to, and ultimately as well, kind of where potential opportunities come up, because there are jobs that get thrown around on those types of groups. I think my experience has been that a lot of jobs in the sports industry don't go public because the majority of the time, either it's gone through someone that's been recommended, or they've found somebody before they need to go public with the job. And again, that's not sport specific, but ultimately you need to be able to put yourself in a position to have a look at what those things are. And I think the biggest piece of advice I've always given for anybody is to just do the work and do the research into it. Sports is such a wide field. You want to say you want to work in sport, but what does that actually mean? You could work for do you want to work for a team? Do you want to work for an agency? Do you want to work for a specific sport? Do you want to look at what I kind of traditionally you always had that rights holder agency brand triangle, but actually now you've got this massive periphery of sports tech and everything else that comes within that, sports law, etc., etc. And so where do you want to put yourself within that? And it takes a bit of time to really understand and think about, what part of sport do you want to work in? Because do you want to be traveling the world working for an F1 team, which is more days abroad than you are at home? Or do you want to be your local football club because that's what you love and that's where you want to go? And differentiating that, they're two totally different roles. And so understanding quite exactly what you want to be doing, what that looks like from a sports perspective. And then ultimately, we have a free tool at the moment, which is, the bane of everyone's life, but also the most kind of advantageous thing in LinkedIn. Look for the people in that field. And I think when I did the Talent Talks podcast, I interviewed a few people, but a lot of the times, one of the core themes that came out was, I have absolutely no issue with people messaging me asking asking for something, but it has to be asking for something. Don't message people or don't connect with people and go, I'd love to connect, I'd love to take you for a coffee. Why? You've got to give that, it's a value proposition thing. You've got to give that person a reason to meet with you or talk to you or give you advice. Be bold on it. I loved what you did with this piece of work here. I loved how you got it into so many newspapers. I loved I loved the digital comms piece of this, whatever it might be. I would have done it like this, or this is how I think about it. Why did you do it like this? Because this is what I would have done, or how I would have done it, or what it might be. And it means the person on the other end of the line sparked a thought and goes, actually, this person's done a bit of work. This person's done a kind of he's thought about this, or she's thought about this. And so I want to go back and talk to that person. And just doing that little bit of extra work, not leaving everything to an AI-enabled application form or whatever it looks like, it sets you apart massively. But what it also does is when that question comes in around, well, why do you want to work for us? You have an answer. You know exactly why you want to work for them. Because this is the industry that I want to be in, this is the sport I want to be in, this is the club that I want to work for, whatever it might be, but it's specific. And equally, if you've got that, you can be consistent as well, because that consistency across all means you're not then searching. One of the kind of biggest challenges, I think, for people that are interviewing at the moment is if you go into an interview that you're not really that sold on, you're never going to sell yourself in the best way. And so you're never going to do the right work, and you're never going to do the kind of prep that you need to do in order to get that job. And we're in an environment at the moment where I want to work in sports, I'm going to try and get anything. But that just reflects badly. And so you don't necessarily get the job, or you don't get past that first interview. And that's a hit on somebody, because as soon as you start getting down that interview process, you start thinking about yourself in that job. You start mentally going, oh, what if I did work here? Actually, this is how much money I'd earn, and therefore I'd be able to do this, or I'd be able to buy this, I'd be able to go there. And then it hits you that you're not getting it. Like, I'm back at square one. And so all comes down to doing this piece of work. And I think one of the interesting, or two interesting bits interviews, but one was with a chief commercial officer, a woman called Rashina Shea. She's brilliant. But she was like, I will respond to everybody who messaged me if they give me a reason to respond. I don't want to. If someone goes, can I just pick your brains? No, because you haven't given me a reason to respond there. And it's related to another one, which is from a guy called Rob Scotland, who heads up comms actually at VO Technologies. And he gives everyone he mentors, which is a slightly controversial, slightly different way of looking at it. And I wouldn't necessarily go this way, but he advises people not to apply for jobs. He said, take the time that you would take applying for a job and reach out to people on LinkedIn instead. find 5 companies that you want to work for, find 5 people from each of those companies that you like the work they've done, or the work they're doing, or what they do as a job. Understand what they do, how they do it, find a reason to contact them, and that is, I like this, can you explain this, I'd love to, this is how I would do this, whatever it might be, and then do that. So you've got 5 companies at the start that you've identified, but by the end of that week you've got 25 people that you could potentially have connected to. Comes back to that networking piece. And so when a job does come around, they go, oh, you know what, actually, Scott did this work. He's been really kind of forthright in his opinion, and I really like the way he kind of spoke to it about it and stuff like that. I'm going to speak to him before this job goes live. But again, it all comes down to this word of work. Doing the work before you do any of the applications or anything else, because it will just help with the. It also helps mentally. It helps you because you then know, right, that job's not right for me. I'm not going to spend the time applying for it. I'm not going to spend the time looking for that person that might help me get that job.
As you explain, I'm thinking back to different businesses I've worked in and teams I've recruited, and actually in one where I brought people in from music, from movies, from sponsorship, from insurance, because I knew they were great communicators in those worlds, but they loved sport, which would elevate them. So the real power of building teams with diverse backgrounds in their experience, but also the difference in different organizations I've worked in levels of scrutiny, process, and other dynamics that affect my recruitment. So if you work in a governing body, there's a greater scrutiny on the process, the governance, doing things the right way, and on various mixes within the organization and team, and how those almost affect your decisions on recruitment. What I'd be interested in getting into is we've had in all our conversation a lot of people asking various things about behaviors and some of the myths around recruitment, and I think it's probably a handful of those we could almost go through and sort of myth bust. I think it's interesting you mentioned one there of at what stage in the process people start thinking, what would it like being to work there? What would my commute be? You are encouraged to visualize yourself in that organization. I'm thinking of one conversation I had recently where even on the digital application, it talked about the lack of parking and how will you get to this site. So it was asking you very specifically to imagine being there. It was this person said it was a digital application process, but once they went in through that portal with a digital application, they were pending for 6 months, 7 months, 8 months. There was no route for follow-ups, and then they just dropped from the system. So everything is there for someone to be able to be communicated with. And this is a business that has a big push on LinkedIn around employee brand. And it struck me as a communicator, when we look after reputation, employee brand, at the very moment where you're wanting someone to feel most connected, and they are most connected, the behaviors then show something very different.
Yeah. I think you want to get, as an employer, you want to get to a stage, or you want to have the ability to go, you're down to the final 2, we're going with person A, but then 6 months down the line you hire person B. And actually, when I referenced the first job I came into sports at PMP Legacy, that's exactly what happened. I got the job first off, and then we needed to bring in somebody at the same level, and the person that was essentially second choice came in after that and got that job. And so, and the only reason I did that was because the interview process had been completely fair. They'd been very and it's a very small company at the time. There wasn't loads of applicants. I'll kind of hold my hands up there, but equally, you knew every step of the process, and they were communicated every single time. For me, it comes back to the point I raised earlier in terms of it is not a priority until it needs to be a priority, hiring. And what I mean by that is there's no warm pipeline, so you're not getting these people coming through, which I kind of touched on earlier. But equally, it means that you know, you've got 2, 3 people working in an HR department that might service a 200-person operation, and that is servicing literally everything from payroll through to hiring and firing. And you know, there is only a set amount of time that people have in the day to do that. So if you are going to go down that route, be open and honest with that up front, and go, if you haven't heard from us within 2 weeks, and then commit to that time frame. If you haven't heard with us 2 weeks, I'm afraid it's no. We'd love to get back to you with more specific, but we just can't because we haven't, you know, the time constraints, etc., etc. It's the bit that the not knowing is the critical mistake, and that happens at every level. And again, I've heard a lot of war stories over the last few years, and we've heard stories kind of being effectively ghosted at final stage for a C-suite job. That is totally unacceptable. And I think for me, what makes it more unacceptable, if that posting is run by a recruitment agency, it is a recruiter's job to keep you up to date with where they are in that process, where you are in that process, and it's a recruiter's job to make sure that they're getting updated from their client effectively. If they are not doing that, they are not doing their job. And it's a bit of a bee in my bonnet that I've had before, where I've kind of been in processes and they've gone, well, yeah, sorry, it didn't work out, or why? So I don't know, it didn't work out. So, well, but I'm down to like final few people here. You need to get me more feedback than that, because that's unacceptable. But it's a, you know, there's less long-term incentives for certain recruiters to have that client management element, because they'll just get another job on. They just get another job on. That's what you need. You need them to get hired, move on, gone. Get hired, move on, gone. And again, I think is pretty unacceptable. But I think that comes down to really kind of expectation setting, because you're right, Chris. You know, if you've got that digital kind of application form and it says on that about parking, actually I quite like that, because it's gone in earlier the details, because it means, oh, actually I need to drive and I can't park, then I'm not going to apply for this job. And so you're trying to cut down the amount of people that are applying anyway, and you'll still get people that apply that can't do that just because they're going to chance it, and just because, you know, try and work some form of deal or whatever it might be, or do whatever they can to get that job. But ultimately, if you're going to have any, whether it's digital or whether it's not, and majority of it's digital now, obviously, you still need to have a proper process and an explained proper process. And get the kind of interviews that I did, and it's a small agency, but they had the best recruitment process I've ever seen, because it was standardized in sport. I mean, it was standardized. Everyone was trained on it, and if you got brought in through that process, you then knew about it because you got brought into it. But then you kind of learned about the back part of it afterwards. So if every time they needed to hire, it was just that same thing, right? We will be back to everybody within 2 weeks, whether or not they're right or not. And if they are right, we'll give them feedback, and that feedback increases every single time you go down the funnel, as it were. And I think that is just, it kind of comes back to this egotism element. Is I think that's just not something that is necessarily focused on within sport, because we can, you know, everyone wants to work in sport. We'll find someone, we'll find someone else, or it doesn't matter. And it takes, and again, I've spoken to people that it takes a real hit on people's confidence when they haven't heard anything, because you're just in this limbo. And then you say you hear 6 months down the line that your details are getting taken off their CRM system because of GDPR purposes, and you're like, well, I didn't even know if I got a job or not, but I'm being taken off the system. Or you're down to a final two, and you find out that you haven't got the job because they've announced the other person has got the job. And certainly at senior level, where you're more likely to get the recruiters in, it is unacceptable in my opinion. But it does, unfortunately, it's not just sport, but it does happen.
Well, I was going to say, I think you don't have to get two or more communications professionals together for very long before we talk about our experience with recruiters. And I would say, actually, just on the counterbalance, is that I've worked with recruiters where they have made the process an enjoyable one, whether I got the job or not. And actually, and this is a side point, it made me think well of the organisation, whether I got the job or not. And I think, when we talk about managing reputations, that is an unseen cost or benefit. So we've all got our stories, but I think one of the things that is probably not understood is how if you are looking for work, whether you're in a job or not, how do you get the best out of the recruiters that come and talk to you? What makes your job, or what would have made your job easier or better or whatever, really? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And just on your point, 100% agreed. There are some fantastic recruiters out there. And that's not to paint everyone with the same brush in any way, shape, or form, because you're right. They're the ones that take the longer term approach of, if I do this right, then they'll come back to me when they're hiring. And,
Right.
and that's ultimately what you want. But anyway, back to the question. It comes down to work. If you think about what a recruiter is, they're essentially a middle person. You've got applicant and you've got employer, and you're the person there that is in the middle of trying to manage those two relationships. Now, if it's a fairly junior job, then it's going to be a little bit more process orientated. You do the work to make sure your CV is right, that it's specific and it's bespoke, and it's not just a you know one CV, one size fits all CV. If there's a cover letter or whatever else you need to do for that, that it is there and ready, and you have done the work as to why you need that job, because that makes the recruiter's life much easier when they're selling you into the organization. Now, again, it also depends on what the contract looks like, because if the recruiter is there just to kind of sift through CVs and send through people that might be interesting, that's a very different thing to go, right, well, this is the short list of people that, and it's the kind of way I tried to approach it was, if I've got 200 applicants to this role, a short list will be given to you of about 10 people, because you don't want to go, again, come back to the time piece, you don't want to go through a 100 person long list to get down to a short list. If I, as a recruiter, had done all of my work to understand what the client wants, I should know from the people that have applied, the people in my network, the people that I know that could do this job, I know what they are looking for, and therefore I can provide that shortlist. And again, I think that's a bit of a kind of difference in some ways of working. But as a young professional, just really focusing down on, right, what do you need me to do? How can I help you in the best possible way to sell me into the organization that I want to be sold into? Basically, try and make their job as easy as possible. And there's a lot of complaints, and I saw a post about this from a recruiter I respect very highly, and she was, people complain about not being heard back by recruiters and not getting responses for recruiters, but it's exactly the same when you're trying to get hold of an applicant. Sometimes you just have to make sure that if you want to be available for something, be available for it. And actually, if you want to be interviewed, make sure that you do the work to interview, because it just looks bad on the recruiter if they've put forward someone that then doesn't do any work, doesn't do the prep, because they expect the recruiter to do all the work for them. That's not the case at all. You have to do the work. You still have to do the work. The recruiter is there to then help you sell in, but the recruiter can't sell you in as a person. You have to sell yourself in as that person. If you think about the kind of sales cycle, that's what it is. You are selling yourself in. So what does that buyer want? What does the employer want? And how am I going to put myself in that position to make sure I tick every single box? The recruiter is there ultimately to go, oh, he ticks every single box, or she ticks every single box, but she can also do this. And this is also the amplification of it, if that makes sense. And I think that's what people tend to forget. They go, I'll put my CV into a recruiter and they can do all the work for me. No, it's not finished there. That's what it comes to. And at a senior level, the recruiter obviously takes on a lot more of that central role, because it's imperative that they know what that senior role has to do, not now, but for 3 years and 5 years. And it's therefore imperative they sell that as much into the person that is applying, or they're headhunting for that, as much as it is to sell that person into the employer. Because really, at that senior level, you're not necessarily looking for skills, you're looking for that cultural fit. And that's a big difference.
Presumably, there's a difference when you're in that recruitment area of the stretch and the future growth of the individual at the level that you're at. At a more junior level, you're recruiting for the moment and you want square peg, square hole. At the most senior levels, you're looking for people who are going to grow, stretch themselves and the organization for 5-10 years. Is there a point in the
Should
middle?
be, yeah.
Well, this is what I'm interested about is, again, we hear from a lot of people who it's almost as if a point in the process, the organization recruiter not necessarily exactly sure what it is they're looking for. And it changes as it goes. And I'd say particularly in communications where there are times where marketing and communications can be put together, and there's times where they're split apart. And sometimes you see marketeers are looked for communications, or it seems sometimes people are not sure exactly what they're looking for and using the process to shape.
100%. Happens a lot. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing in certain circumstances. I think in an ideal world, you know exactly what you're looking for, the type of person you're looking for, and the type of job they're going to do. But we don't live in an ideal world. And equally, that then again pigeonholes you down into looking for a very specific type or sort of personal type of experience. What an interview process and an application process allows the employer to do is refine, right, actually, this is what we thought we were looking for, but everyone we've spoken to here is missing this X factor that we're looking for. And so what is that X factor, and how do we kind of expand that out? I think it is still down to the employer to do a lot of work before they put that job description out, before they put the hire out, to understand what the core objectives of that job are and the type of attributes that will feed into those core objectives. Because if you just think, right, well, I need a commercial director, let's look for a commercial director. But what is that commercial director actually responsible for? Are they looking for someone that can really just hit the phones hard and sell? Are they looking for a strategic seller who can really manage long-term relationships in order to upsell and to renew? Are they looking for someone that has real knowledge and in-depth experience of how to utilize new revenue sources? You know, all of these different bits and pieces are totally different people. You might have someone that can do a bit of everything, and that comes down to the kind of slightly more generalist role. But it's the same with as you know, with comms and PR. You know, you could be looking for someone who is excellent in social media, or you could be looking at someone who is brilliant, but they have all the relationships with all the top newspapers at the very highest levels and can get into whatever you need to. They're two different people, two different skill sets. You might have someone that bridges the gap a little bit, but it does come down to the employer to go, well, what is it we actually need? What do I need as a boss, as a CEO, or as a head of department, this person to do? What do their colleagues need them to do? And what do the other departments need them to do? And I can guarantee 95% of organizations don't do this. And that's not just sports specific, but ultimately by understanding all of that, you are then able to understand, right, these are the attributes that we're looking for, and the A players that we are then looking for to come into those attributes, we can more directly define. And it might not necessarily look at, right, you've got this skill set, this piece of experience, but if you've got this attribute that can fit into that skill set, then you've got someone that we can take forward. And I think that's the difference in looking at a tick box of, have you got this experience, this degree, worked with this person, or whatever it might be, versus can you do this? Can you do this? Can you do this? It doesn't matter where your experience necessarily lies, but if you can do that, then it all comes to a head, and you've got that person that you want to bring into the organization. And there is always an element of interviewing two different people, and you might hire the person you didn't think was going to get the job because they didn't have all the experience that you were looking for necessarily, but what they had was the attribute that you didn't think you needed at the time, and they've convinced you during that interview process, because they're selling themselves, that that's what you need more than anything else. And it might, and there's nothing you can do if you're the person that's got all the experience as an applicant. There's nothing really you can do about that. But the feedback needs to come in then from the employer again to go, look, you were brilliant, but this person just convinced us this is what we needed slightly more, and I think that is right. But we'd love to keep you in contact, and if there's something else that comes up in a similar field or whatever, then we'd love to. And it comes down to the employer branding piece, where you are just communicating constantly even if it's blanket at the very beginning, you're communicating constantly with the people that have applied for those roles, so that when another job comes up within that department or within that company, you know you've already got people who are warm to you who will come back and apply.
I think the idea, Dan, of hiring for attributes rather than experiences is quite an exciting one, I have to say. And I mean, we may not get onto this, but I think getting feedback if you're unsuccessful is a really good thing to ask for. But we mentioned myths earlier on, and we all, Chris and I both want to go on to this, which is the perception now is that recruitment is all done by robots, by AI, and if you want to get past the first hurdle, you need to do X and Y. What's the reality?
It's not far off, if I want to stop. But I think uh, I have my personal opinion and I have experience, but I think undoubtedly you have a lot of recruitment tools out there that will use AI to help identify people from a headhunting perspective, which is brilliant, because again, it enables you to look much wider than you would necessarily look. So if you look at what experience mix or different industries and stuff like that, you could put the right criteria in, and it will come back with people that you would never have found if you were just looking through LinkedIn, or if you put the job description out and they wouldn't have applied because they wouldn't have seen the job. Just they're not in the right kind of ecosystem, as it were. There's ultimately two kind of challenges I find with it. Is you have companies, and again, understandably so, but you have companies that are utilizing AI as a first screen. So what that means is you put your CV in, or you'll put your online application in, and the AI will screen for keywords. If they're not in that, if those keywords aren't in that CV, they will automatically get rejected. And again, you come down to the time piece of it. Just means that from 200 applicants, you get down to 100 without having to spend loads of time going through 200. And again, a little kind of story got told years and years ago about a particular senior person in a bank who had a pile of CVs on his desk, and as he walked in, picked up half the CVs, put them in the bin, and said they were the unlucky half. So it's happened forever. It's just a different way of doing it, and probably slightly less callous way of doing it with AI, because at least there is some parameters to it. But AI is inherently biased, and everybody we know that it's being worked on by all these AI companies. And so that has to be taken into account. But what you also then have is the flip side of that is applicants using AI. And there's nothing wrong with applicants using AI as long as you use it as a base and work off it, rather than just use it to do the work for you. Because you will then get applicants pushing a CV that have all the right keywords in there, because they've put the job description into ChatGPT and gone, what are the keywords that are in this job description that will take me through a recruitment software and then write me a CV that is matched to this. And so you then get to a point where you've gone from these 200 CVs down to 100 CVs through AI software, going, well, we've still got 200 CVs because they're being filtered through. And so, personal opinion, we'll get to this kind of point where AI is trying to fight against each other, and then it'll just go back down to being a bit more of a manual process, or something will come out where you have like AI trackers that you can see that something's being used by AI. And equally, I've been told stories of people putting in keywords in the background of their CVs in white in text boxes, so that it gets through the AI software, but it's still a bit more of a crafted CV that is right for them. I don't advise that in any way, shape, or form, just as an FYI, but it has happened. Again, I think this is a little bit more. There's a lot more junior focused. Excuse me. Happens at senior level, but it happens at senior level from a recruitment perspective, in trying to find the right people from a headhunting perspective, so that you can go, right, I've scoured 700 people that might be of interest here. You can't with AI, you can do that in a couple of hours. Without AI, it takes you a couple of weeks. So that's where, from a recruitment perspective, it comes in very handy. But ultimately, it's exactly the same as social media algorithms and stuff like that. If you don't hit the right algorithm, you're just not it's not gonna blow up, as it were. And it's the same with recruitment. If you don't hit the right keywords you might not get through, even if you think you're the best person for that. And my advice again is, don't shy away from using it, but just use it in the right way. If you know there are keywords, if you know that a certain organization uses a certain CRM system, and I won't mention what it is because I can't remember what it's called, but it's fairly obvious that that will be AI based. Put the job description through AI. It's like, well, what are the keywords? But then you do that work to make sure that your CV has those keywords in, but in the right frame, in the right way. And the biggest thing I would say as well, actually, if you are going to use AI to write your CV, it's fucking obvious. It is so obvious when an application comes through and it's not been written by you, it's been written by AI, because A, it's Americanized, and B, half the sentences don't actually make sense. So you've got to really think about utilize it as a base, but you have to do the work. You can come back to that point to build on top of that.
Dan, honestly, I feel like we could talk for another day and a half, and still only scratch the surface of what you've got to say. But Chris, we are going to run out of time very shortly. Chris, do you want to wrap on what you think we've heard today?
Yeah, I'll try and bring a handful of themes, and I think it's fascinating. We could do part 2, part 3, part 4. I'm really interested in the way we've talked about the sort of 3 routes in, the one through network, the one of kind of direct application, and the other of recruiter, and how they work at each stage of a career, and how to get the best out of each of those. And some fantastic, real practical advice you've given us. The handful of things, I think, your word at the very beginning about generalism and specialism, and how to make the most of them and when to bring them in at every stage of a career, when you're a generalist, when you're a specialist in the recruitment process. I think the way you talked about having that grounding, but then seeking opportunity, something that is part of you, not to fall back on, that is the very foundation, but also how in sport you need to use the passion you have and find opportunity. The third was some of the things that you said about the difference in sport, the frustrations, but also some of the upsides. And you talked a bit about ego and pay, and it reminded me of some other industries like music industry of past where because people wanted to be there, the shortcuts that were taken, and some of your frustrations, I think, around that. The use of network, and so crucially with purpose, using it with, as you used, your word was reason, and finding that reason why that person would want to talk to you. I think process and communication, which is what we're all about, that need for feedback and communication at every level in every process. And when it falls short, perhaps ways in which the person who's wanting to be recruited can help that process. And then, again, importantly for anyone who's listening from communication is actually the link at every stage back to the reputation of the business. And recruitment is about people and the importance of communication. So whether you're a recruiter and you try to do the right people, giving the right thing to people, giving constructive feedback, your word as well, very powerful, honesty through the process. Just remembering they're real people with real dreams. And you're also trying to get the best person for the role. And I've got to say this finally, just for Scott, because the excitement when he talked about attributes and experience, and I just love that way of looking at a role in a different way, and how that opens up the recruitment process to maybe bringing people in from other areas with other skill sets and opening up the world of sport. So I found that absolutely fascinating. You said to us before we started that you would have potentially Trump levels of swearing, and I've got to congratulate you on only having the 2. So
yes,
no trigger warning.
I really held back there. Sorry.
So anything, Scott?
Yeah, and just thank you again, Dan. And just to wrap up, we do like to ask, or I like to ask a Kirsty Young question at the end, which is thinking about your younger self leaving university, just entering the sports industry, as we now call it. What piece of advice would you give your younger self, if you could speak to him now?
Yeah, I've thought about this. And without sounding too much like Edith P.S., I don't regret, and I don't regret anything. And I honestly, if this is not to sound like I've got an ego in this sense, I don't think I would change anything, because everything that I've done, I have learned from. If I was talking to my younger self or talking to somebody else coming into the industry, there it would be to just take the opportunity. I've had some amazing experiences, and I've had some amazing opportunities that have happened because I've kind of put myself out there a little bit. And whether that's the sports industry next gen that I was part of, whether it was the Chime Young Leadership Group, whatever it's called, that I was part of, all of those different things that you put yourself out on a bit of a pedestal to apply to, and you fight the imposter syndrome urge of doing all of that, but you just say yes, and you say yes to those opportunities, and there's a huge movement and the power of saying no nowadays. But what I mean by that is, don't be afraid to take the opportunity. If it's wrong, you're still young enough to be able to rectify it. And I think, I look at what I've done and and where I am now, and again, coming back to this word generalist, I've learned more in the last 15 years of doing what I was doing than if I had taken an opportunity and just worked within a kind of linear pathway, because I wouldn't have had the opportunities that I would have had. I wouldn't have had the experiences that I would have had. And I might have enjoyed it. Of course I might have, but ultimately for me, it's just about, if you get the opportunity, take it with both hands, work hard, and something else will come up. Yeah, more opportunities will come up from it. And I think that for me is the key thing, is just look at where those opportunities are and take them.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, and take the opportunity. We will. I think that's good advice for anyone, really. And yes, and here's to the generalists. Here's to the generalists. Yeah, thank you.
Dan, thanks so much for great advice every step of the way. We should do parts 2 and 3. We'd also love to hear if anyone takes any specific parts of your advice and gets some success from it. We'd love to hear that. We've had a range of these interviews. All of them are available on YouTube channel. Look through the CIPR website and find the links for those. Sign up for the newsletter or become a member of the CIPR for more of this. Dan, thank you so much, and all the best for your next steps too. And
Yeah,
thanks.
good
Thank you,
luck.
Chris. Thanks, Scott. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.